Thanks, Bill. Thanks for everyone for coming along. When Bill raised the prospect of this little symposium, he said, oh, look, why don't we just sort of get a few mates together and have a chat? And I said, oh, that sounds good, you know, it's just good to have chats with mates. And then, like a couple of weeks ago, he said, where's your paper then? So I said, well, I'm a retired gentleman, I don't have time to write papers or do any of that stuff. So I put this little presentation together. It goes over a lot of the material that's been covered already. And also, I've read Ross's excellent piece in the latest journal where he covers a lot of the same stuff about complexity and what happens in the farm. I want to talk about R&D. R&D is just any other investment made on the farm, and when you keep the impacts at the farm level, then you use exactly the same things, the same decision criteria that Vic, Bill and Catherine have been talking about. The difference with R&D is that if it's good, lots of people adopt it and it has market impacts, and so there's feedback effects from the market. So what I want to talk about a little bit is the relationship between complex open systems and then how that affects the net result of investing in R&D, not just the initial result. Right, so this is all pretty obvious stuff. Most of our farms are complex farming systems. Most have multiple enterprises, and most have multiple activities. And that means that there's complex production functions, complex isochrones, complex production possibilities curves underlying all of that. And that means typically that there's lots of flexibility in that system for substituting inputs as prices change up and down, and substituting outputs, right? So some of those are constrained by things like rotations and environmental factors and the like, but typically if you've got a complex system with a complex production function behind it, you've got non-zero input substitution elasticities and non-zero output transformation elasticities, right? People change the mixes of inputs and outputs as prices change. Also, we know that the whole marketing system, the off-the-farm gate stuff, is getting more complex, longer, more extended, and as Vic was talking about, there's this move towards more differentiated products. Okay, that's just background. What it means, though, in terms of R&D, is that when you've got these complex marketing systems overlaid on the complex production system, that the more complex the system, the longer, the more extended, the more value that there is off-farm relative to on-farm, then the smaller the share of total benefits from any R&D flows back to the farm, right? That's just the farmer's share of the consumer's dollar idea. There's this much value of production at the farm level, there's this much gross value when it's measured at its final point, retail level, and the bigger that is relative to that, the smaller the share of any benefits that flow back to producers. Right? So offsetting that, of course, is that the incidence of any levies that producers pay to fund that R&D is also smaller if it's more complicated. So that's a scale thing, right? Then you've got, if you overlay that with non-zero input substitution elasticities and output transformation elasticities, which also come from complex systems, that further modifies the distribution of those benefits back to the farm. Okay? And other input suppliers who now have relatively cheaper inputs to use, they cop some of the benefits of the investment you're making. So what this is one of the implications of all this is the more complex the system, okay, the benefits of R&D to producers depends on where that investment's made, which means off-farm versus on-farm. So here's some work that I was involved in with Xian Zhao way back in 91. All these are just 1% changes in the cost of production at different levels of the beef market. if there's a reduction in cost of production at the farm level, in weaner production, the very lowest level of the market, producers get about a third of the total benefits of that investment scattered across all of the markets and all of the different products. The higher up the chain you go, where the investment's made, so if there's some new whiz-bang investment in domestic distribution and retailing, right, there's a much smaller proportion of the total benefit of that goes back to producers. Okay? So that's an implication of open systems, is that the more open, the more complex the system. If you're investing in R&D, it's much better to invest closer to where you are. Another thing from Stuart Mowler's pig work, over on the right, those two over on the right-hand side there, not only does this vary by scale of operation, but also when you've got related activities, and here we've got just two different types of pig production, pig meat production, pork production, bacon production, two different end products, but some of those could actually be produced by the same company, if not on the same farm. Once you take account of the complexity of the production relationships between them, and then the marketing relationships that happen out there, investment in one particular part of that industry can cause negative effects on the other part of the industry. And it could be in the same company. Okay? If you're investing, an example there is investing in bacon and production R&D has a negative effect on pork processors, for example. So depending on those cross-commodity relationships, investments in different activities, different enterprises can have these crossover effects that are not always positive. Right, openness. To me, openness in terms of R&D means openness to basically traded commodities. Right, so this is either buying or selling stuff outside the region, outside the state, outside the country, in the world market. And once you overlay on top of that complex marketing systems, then you've got all sorts of different permutations and combinations about different levels of complexity from different types of products that you might choose to produce, which just backs up the stuff Nick was talking about, that it's hard work making decisions about product differentiation and things like that, because there's just so much activity out there. So the net result of all that is, if you're a net exporter, or your excess demand is in the export market, then you're facing a demand curve that's fairly flat, then there's not much point doing R&D that's aimed at increasing price. Okay? Level of price, generic level of price. So, the same comments go for generic marketing in overseas markets. Okay? If you're facing a fairly flat demand curve, there's not much you can do as a producer to affect that price, right? You have to respond back to that. Example is in the beef industry that I know a bit about. The price of cattle in Australia is 80% determined by the US export price. There's not much that Australian producers can do to influence US export price. So R&D, which aims at influencing the level of price, pretty much forget. R&D, which influences quality and therefore price relativities, that's a better game. Okay, because then there might be some success through differentiation. There might be these positives in there. But then it's still subject to the constraints of the complexity, so that there's the further away that you're putting the R&D in, the quality has an impact, then the smaller the share that's coming back to you. And that leaves, of course, one of the truths that we know about is that R&D which influences costs or yields is usually the best bet for producers. They get a higher share of that because it happens close to them, and they've got more control over it. And in the industries that I know something about, you've got to be able to show that influencing quality has to have roughly 4 times greater impact than something which decreases costs for them to be equally beneficial to producers. Dynamics. We've been through this, we know that everything depends on these complex biosystems which take there's long time frames involved in all the things you have to do, making the decision to plant, making the decision to breed, all the way through to the end product that tells you the result of that initial decision on a new variety or a new wool or a new something else. And that can be many years. And that will be, they vary of course in a complex farming system. There's different time periods for all the different activities, all the different enterprises you might choose to niche up. In broadacre agriculture, you've got cropping systems on annual basis, and you might have cattle systems on, that take 5 to 10 years before you get the impact of an investment in R&D. Just said that. Different cash flows, of course. So once you've got different investments over different time periods that have different impacts, then your cash flows are quite different, and your end result on debt ratios and all that thing are quite different. Okay, the last part is variability. So we know that there's huge amounts of variability out there. Saw some very disturbing things from Quentin this morning on that map of Australia with all the above and way above and way below averages. A couple of things I wanted to point out here that relate to Catherine's work is one of the things about variability in farming systems is the variability of ability to make decisions, and the variability of the advice that people get. Okay, so the effectiveness of an investment decision in R&D is often dependent on how well that tool or technology or whatever it is actually implemented in the system. And it could be far different from what happens in an experiment or on a research station. So people would know the Davidson and Martin rule of thumb that any research result that comes out of a research station should immediately be discounted by 30%. Because in the real world there's all sorts of other constraints that mean that the effectiveness of that decision won't be the same. That just says that there's lots of stuff out there, and it's not only prices of inputs, but it's also qualities of inputs which are often variable, and that has an impact on whether a technology is effective.